This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, markets were quite jittery today after the US Fed signaled a March hike in interest rates and sustained policy tightening. Now, emerging market stocks slumped to an over 14-month low. The emerging market stocks gauge dropped 1.6% as China property and tech stocks slid, with Alibaba down 7.2% on the day. The broader emerging market stock index is down about 4.2% so far this week, set for its worst weekly performance since August. Now, also coming up on today's show, South Africa hikes its repo rate to 4%. China gets the green light to impose tariffs on US goods. And Nigeria exhibits what it calls the world's largest rice pyramids. And our starting point tonight is in South Africa. The Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee has decided to raise the repo rate to 4%, marking an increase of about 25 basis points. Now, 4 members of the committee preferred an increase and 1 member preferred an unchanged stance. The Reserve Bank governor says the rate hike comes against a backdrop of higher global and local inflation. The governor further adds that the economic and financial conditions are expected to remain more volatile for the foreseeable future. And heading to Nigeria, the central bank has left its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 11.5%. That's to help the country's fragile economic recovery. Now, Africa's leading economy is battling double-digit inflation as well as low revenues, which have hampered the government's ability to stimulate growth. Here's CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam with the details.
After a careful balancing of the benefits and downside risks of each policy option, MPC decided to hold all policy parameters constant.
Nigeria's central bank governor, Godwin Emefiele, announcing the decision of the Monetary Policy Committee after their first meeting of the year. Other parameters held constant are the CRR at 27.5% and liquidity ratio 30%. The decision is coming amid rising inflation and calls for extraordinary interventions to rein in sticky prices.
In 2021, headline inflation was above 18%, double the central bank's 9% target. An 8-month decline followed by a spike in December put the figure at 15.63%, still far from the Apex Bank's single-digit target. The World Bank projected that Nigeria could have one of the highest inflation rates in 2022 and the 7th highest in sub-Saharan Africa, a trend that could hamper economic recovery and erode the purchasing power of many Nigerians.
But the committee maintains that the spike is only temporary, attributing it to the rise in demand during the Yuletide.
I trust their judgment. And if you actually look at the parameters, Q1 2021, we grew by 0.51%. Q2, we grew at over 5.something%. Q3, we also grew. But suddenly in the last quarter, we had a decline. And then inflation spiked. And then the World Bank came with that report. I strongly believe that they must have assessed all parameters and maybe looked at what may have caused that one quarter slide. So I think I trust the MPC, and we will only sit back and watch.
The coronavirus pandemic, too, left Nigeria's economy battered. Several businesses had to shut down and are only trying to pick up. The central bank's been providing various interventions to micro, small and medium businesses to cushion the impact of the pandemic. But experts say much more is required to rebuild the economy.
The CBN should go the whole hog of ensuring that these monies are applied to what it is they were giving out for, which is the micro, small, and medium enterprise sector of the economy to grow different things. The other thing CBN needs to do is to do multi-sectoral engagement of the different MDAs responsible for ensuring that manufacturing is done. One of the things that's also being discussed is issue of access to markets. And then the CBN governor today in his briefing mentioned the issue of infrastructure, issue of logistics, because if you produce and you're not able to move out those things out of the bushes into the places where they will be bought, then we'll have an issue right there.
The committee says its decision to maintain status quo is geared towards supporting growth, boosting production, and ultimately controlling inflation. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, let's move on now. The 2021 Global Corruption Perception Index is out, and it reveals that corruption is at a standstill. Now, the ranking of perceived public sector corruption included about 180 countries and territories worldwide. 131 countries have made no significant progress against corruption in the last decade, and that's despite multiple commitments. The stagnation in corruption has been linked to the deterioration of human rights and democracy, which of course are key in fighting graft. Well, let's find out more about those findings from Samuel Kaninda. He's a regional expert for Sub-Saharan Africa at Transparency International. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Kaninda. Now, of course, let's start off with the global picture. Now, according to the report, the pandemic has been used in many countries across the world as an excuse to curtail basic freedoms and sidestep important checks and balances. That is what the report says. So give us a sense of your assessment on the corruption levels as they stand worldwide.
Thank you for having me. I think the picture, as you put it, says it. I mean, in most of the countries, we still have 2/3 of the countries that are assessed on the Corruption Perceptions Index who are scoring below 50. And we've also observed that there's been no significant progress, with the exception of a few. So those few, and you can then conclude from that there's a lot that needs to be done. As mentioned as well, there are commitments exist. We have a convention at the global level. Different regions have their own conventions, like Africa has the African Union Convention. But even at the level of regional economic communities, there are conventions. So these international treaties exist. There are commitments like those of the Open Government Partnership, OGP, which is celebrated its 10th anniversary last year. So the world, and Africa in particular, is not short of commitments. But what we observe is some slowness or apathy when it comes to the implementation of those commitments. So the call is really for leaders, governments, and all sectors of society, because business, the private sector also has a role to play, and civil society, to really take bolder action if we are to reverse this picture.
Well, let's focus on the region, because we know 2021 was quite a turbulent year for the sub-Saharan African region. Now, you say the pandemic exacerbated the problems the region already had with corruption. How so?
Well, firstly, like many regions of the world, the pandemic, while it was a health crisis, it also affected many countries from an economic point of view. So economies were affected because of the closure of some borders, or the shrinking of the space and the slowing down of those economies. And that also led to the increase in terms of challenges for especially the least resource countries, or those with difficulties to generate domestic resources. But even in terms of resources that were availed for the response to COVID, we've also seen that in many instances, we had cases in South Africa, we heard of some cases in Kenya and Nigeria. So a few countries, I was just mentioning some of the major economies as well, where the use of those funds did not really pass the test of scrutiny in terms of transparency and accountability to ensure that those limited resources would indeed be used for their originally intended purpose. So these added to the existing burden of corruption on those who need to access basic social services. So that's more the petty corruption that a citizen on the continent will encounter when they need to go to a public hospital, to have their kid at school. That's one side, but there's also, particularly as we are talking about the pandemic, the high-level corruption, which is less visible. It benefits a few, but at the expense of the majority. So we have all of those levels of corruption coming in.
Well, on the upside, there were some countries that showed significant improvements, such as Senegal and even surprisingly Ethiopia. Tell us or give us some insight into the nations that showed encouraging improvements in their efforts to stem corruption, and tell us why you pointed to them.
Yeah, Seychelles is the top performer in the region with a score of 70 out of 100. And it's also important to mention that this year we were able to analyze the performance of the region, but also specific countries over the decade. So going from 2012 to this year, and even there, Seychelles has shown significant improvement, and that is attributable to, firstly, the political will, the leadership at the highest level of government to implement open government and anti-corruption reforms, institutions being there, resourced, and making sure that anti-corruption institutions are able to function, to operate with no interference from political offices, and that they have the resources they need. But beyond institutions and laws, which, by the way, many of the countries, even the ones faring poorly, have, it's important to have a checks and balances, allowing civil society to do its work of civil oversight, of public action by government, the media to report on any story, even allegations of corruption. That should allow anti-corruption institutions in the country to investigate and, where the case, where applicable, to prosecute. So, and that's a common thread from the Seychelles, Senegal, where a number of institutions were put in place and resourced to do the work. And we see that even with Ethiopia, that the leadership with the change of regime with the current prime minister, from those years, we've seen that there's progress that is made. They are still not where they would be considered to be out of endemic systemic corruption, but they are on the right track. And that's also the message, that efforts should be sustained so that the change can also be sustainable.
Now, overall, the index shows that about 80% of countries across the region have pretty much stagnated in the last 10 years. What were some of the greatest threats to progress? Have they changed in recent times as well?
There's not been much progress, and observing the continent, I mean, more recently, now we have what happened in Burkina Faso. So we also highlighted the fact that the past year or few years in Africa, we see protracted armed conflicts, civil wars. You talk about the Great Lakes region, you have Mozambique, where there was a rise of terrorist threats, all the way to the whole of Sahel. So all those are also both exacerbated by deeply seated corruption issues, and corruption also contributes to the perpetuation of those conflicts, of the uprisings we are seeing in some countries with insurgencies where elected leaders are being deposed. So there's a vicious circle where corruption, it enables human rights abuses, it deprives citizens of their rights, where leaders do not hear what the concerns of citizens are, and that leads to some of the unrest we are seeing. And in those contexts, again, you see more human rights violations happening. So it's like a vicious circle, and over the continent, you could see that there's that worrying trend, which then leads to a situation where it's difficult to have notable progress. And then you have countries at the bottom like South Sudan, Somalia, which have really been fragile states in the case of South Sudan since its acceding to independence almost 10 years ago. So those are situations where it's difficult to control corruption. So it's important that the African Union, as the continental body, works with member states to put their fingers on the real issues, because the convention is there, as I say, institutions are there to address what is not working, and there's need for bolder action to address the issue holistically of corruption. And we also note, and that's also accepted even by AU leaders, that we as a continent cannot address the issue of development, sustainable development, if governance remains a challenge, and particularly the fight against corruption. If we lag behind, then the resources we have on the continent will not benefit the majority. It will still be for a few to benefit at the expense of the majority.
Right. Well, we thank you so much, Mr. Kaninda, for those great insights. That, of course, was Samuel Kaninda, regional expert for sub-Saharan Africa at Transparency International. Now, over in South Africa, despite plans to gradually move away from fossil fuels, Eskom now says that it will have to burn more coal this year in order to generate enough electricity. Environmental activists are outraged at this. Some environmental companies approached the courts last year in an attempt to keep Eskom from building new coal-fired power plants. But the state-owned power utility relies heavily on coal. Over 80% of the power it produces is generated from coal. Here's Sumitra Naidu with more.
Eskom has acknowledged that there is a need to reduce its carbon footprint, but it may take the power utility a lot longer to move away from coal. The power utility has been struggling with turbine breakdowns due to aging infrastructure and poor maintenance. It's also had issues at its new plants.
You've also got to remember that there are some legacy coal projects, particularly Medupi and Kusile. And in particular, Kusile is actually connecting new units to the grid, commissioning those units, and generating electricity. And this is a process that's going to be happening in the next 2 years.
There's also been a delay with independent power producers. The IPPs were meant to come online but are waiting for government approval. Eskom says it will need to burn more coal this year in order to generate 2% more electricity.
Obviously, an increase of the use of coal is just taking the whole electricity generation regime, if you like, in the wrong direction. I think it probably is more of an indictment on the whole system and the way the planning has happened and the implementation over the last years and even decades.
South Africa's energy master plan includes 1,500 megawatts of new coal development by 2030. But the plan is being challenged in court. The Centre for Environmental Rights is representing 3 climate groups that want Eskom to back away from building any more coal-fired power stations.
So that really challenges the minister's decision to procure 1,500 megawatts of new coal. It also challenges the IRP insofar as coal is still provided for in that strategic document. So politically, nothing is moved. When here's sort of whispers from various corners that the IRP needs to be looked at, and everyone agrees that it really does. But we've seen nothing concrete in that regard.
The Department of Energy wants to move away from coal by 2030 and use natural gas as a transition fuel. But with constant delays and Eskom's heavy reliance on coal, this plan may take longer to materialize. It will also be difficult for South Africa to meet its international climate commitments. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And now a look at some other corporate headlines today. Shares in South Africa's Telkom have dropped as much as 5.7% as the market awaits clarity on the investigations into allegations of corruption and malfeasance. Now, this comes after President Cyril Ramaphosa ordered a probe into the firm. The firm adds that it will deal with the investigation on its merits in the appropriate forum at the appropriate time. And South Africa's ShopRite has reported a 10% growth in sales in the 6 months to end January. This is despite the fallout from the civil unrest that affected 230 of its stores and the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. Now, excluding the negative effects of the temporary closure of liquor stores in South Africa, total sales of merchandise rose 8.2%. And food and beverage giant Nestle is expected to offer cash incentives to cocoa farmers and their families in Côte d'Ivoire with the aim of reducing child labor. The firm adds that it will spend an estimated $1.4 billion by 2030. Now, farmers will start receiving the cash if they send their children to school rather than out to tend to crops. Nestle says this is all part of a push to purchase all of its cocoa through a fully traceable, directly sourced supply chain by 2025. And travelers from Kenya will now be allowed entry into Dubai from Saturday. That's after the United Arab Emirates lifted a ban that it had imposed on all flights from Kenya since last year. The UAE barred entry of flights from Kenya on December 20th after establishing that travelers from Nairobi were testing positive for COVID-19 on arrival in the Middle East country despite presenting negative test results. And that's a recap of other headlines at this hour. Well, let's head into a short break now, still to come on the show. Kenyans living abroad sent home a record $3.7 billion in 2021. And Egypt expects $7 billion in revenue from the Suez Canal this year.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
This is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front
clear
line.
View of this front line position.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back. Now, Kenyans living abroad sent home a record $3.7 billion in 2021 as they supported families at home during the festive season. A shift in technology has boosted the remittance industry, particularly following the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw remittance inflows continue to grow steadily over the last 7-year period, representing an average annual growth rate of 14%. Now, according to the Central Bank of Kenya, remittance inflows by country of origin showed that the top source countries in 2020 were the US with $1.67 billion, the UK with $230 million, and South Africa with $196 million. Well, let's now get more on those findings from Managing Director of Pangia Trust, Anne Lowy. She joins us now via Zoom. Great to have you with us on the show today, Anne. Now, we definitely expected to see the pandemic greatly impact remittance flows this year, last year as well. In fact, we saw the World Bank projected that the flow of global remittances to lower middle income countries would decline sharply by about 20%. Based on your findings, was this the case?
Thank you so much for having me. The finding for the diaspora remittance mapping that we have done in 2021, supported by CEDA, shows that remittances were on the increase, and that was led by with pandemic. There was cut of livelihood support for low-income countries. That meant that more families needed to be supported. On the other hand, there was increase of healthcare workers' engagement. That meant more income, more increased income for them. So with that, two dynamics led to increase of remittances sent back home. The other consideration was also the businesses that there was a lot of digitization during that period. So there was shift of use of cash to digital inflows, which led to more of documentation and reporting of remittances from informal to formal.
Now, quite interesting is that your findings also show that there continues to be high appetite for investment opportunities in Africa from the diaspora. Give us some insight into how these investments are structured.
Right. The high interest of investments are led by information flow. And also, one of the other reasons is interest by young generation who would want to invest in a diverse field away from traditional means, which has been assets and land. So there is increase on wanting to invest in impact-driven businesses. And also driving of interest is also digitization technology. So with more cropping of businesses that are led or driven by technology, comes with more interest by young people, that age group, the generation wanting to invest. So one of the key gaps that we saw is lack of platforms, of channels that can uptake investment. And that's where Pangia is coming in to structure and create a platform where we can showcase businesses for investment with transparency that diaspora networks can be able to choose on their own, be informed on where to invest, and then channel their investments towards those business cases that we will be able to profile as Pangia Trust.
Now, looking forward, what would you say are the trends that will drive remittances and certainly the growth of the sector going forward, especially in terms of technology and regulation as well?
The key driver one is incentives towards diaspora community. So more engagement of diaspora communities and incentives in terms of programs and government being involved in the conversation. Secondly, technology, being that there is more seamless flow of remittances from one region to the next. The other bit is also reduction of the cost, we have seen one of the findings is that cost was high barrier for remittances. With more reduction of the cost that will come with digitization and technology, then it will lead to more growth and increase in inflows.
Well, we'll certainly be watching that closely. Many thanks for those great insights, Anne. That, of course, is Anne Alawi, Managing Director at Pangaea Trust. Well, let's move on now to Ethiopia. The country has announced its agriculture sector earned about $1.3 billion from the export of commodities. And that happened in the first 6 months of its fiscal year that started in July 2021. Now, a boom in global prices of coffee and sesame contributed to this growth. And CGTN's Girum Chala has the latest on that from Addis Ababa.
The last 6 months of agriculture-based export trade have been a story of success for Ethiopia. The Ministry of Agriculture said $1.32 billion has been garnered mainly from the export of coffee, sesame and other agricultural products. And this performance is a 109% achievement based on the half-year plan of the government. It is a 32% increase compared to last year's earnings, which was also a record for the country. Ethiopia, under its economic reform, plans to tap more out of the agriculture sector and is implementing transformational schemes for the industry to uplift the lives of its farmers and the entire economy to earn more from the sector. Similarly, agriculture-based industrial growth is being expedited through the agro-processing industrial parks that are now found across the country. Records show more than 80% of Ethiopians depend directly or indirectly on agriculture, and is one sector the Eastern African nation has been struggling to modernize. Officials have also vowed to intensify efforts and expand international market reach, in addition to increasing variety and volume of products during the second half of the year. Grumtara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Meanwhile, there is a crisis brewing in South Africa's grain sector. That's after heavy rains over the last 2 months. Maize harvests have been dealt a blow in some parts of the country, and it is estimated that about 25% of crops have been damaged in the key maize-producing provinces of Free State and KwaZulu-Natal. Here's Angela Coppola with more.
The rains came at the wrong time for some farmers in the Wesselsbron area in the Free State province.
So last year we also had above normal and we had damage already with rain. So our profile was saturated as is because we've got a water table at 1.5 meters and it was saturated early in the season. So as we planted early, hoping that the normal rainfall would come on its time using of that profile. And just as we had finished, then the rain started early.
We've
had about 500 millimeters in the last 2 months. That's about double what we usually get. So where we farm, it's flat. We don't have much drainage. So we do quite well when it doesn't rain a lot. But with La Nina coming from the west, this year it was just too much.
Crop damage in the Wesselsbron area has been extensive and the water had nowhere to drain away in the flatter areas. Farmers have lost between 50 and 70% of their crops there.
The rain took out the oxygen and the roots stopped growing because it's completely water, so they don't have oxygen. There we were managed to till when the lands were a bit drier. There we could get a bit of oxygen into the soil and there's a certain amount of recovery.
We had a huge amount of damage on our land. Our mealies, sunflowers, soy are literally drowned. They're deep underwater. They can't handle those drowning conditions. It's all going to rot. So my crop is half of what it should be.
The farmers don't get any financial or economic government support.
Hopeful that you can just get something to carry part of the insect costs, because our insect costs are running very high at this stage. We don't have help from the government or anything. It's all dependent on our own, finances and stuff.
Climate change is a reality for those farmers in the Free State. However, the other farmers in the rest of the country seem to have got away scot-free. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, Egypt is forecasting that revenues from the Suez Canal will rise to $7 billion by the end of 2022, and that's compared to its highest ever earnings of $6.3 billion, which it achieved in 2021. Officials at the Suez Canal Authority said they will seek to increase its share of global trade to more than 12% compared to the current 10%, which it achieved in 2021. From Cairo, here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim with more.
The Suez Canal's record annual revenue of $6.3 billion in 2021 was the highest recorded by the North African state, and now authorities are aiming higher and are targeting over $7 billion in 2022.
There are 35 million to 40 million containers roaming international seas annually. 20% of these containers pass through the Suez Canal. Why so? Because the Suez Canal is the shortest link between the east and west of the globe. For example, trade between the largest economies in the world, China and the EU, passes through Suez Canal, which makes it one of the most important waterways for international trade.
Construction work in the canal that started in 2014 is in its final stage, so it can absorb more traffic by international shippers.
The new phase approved by the President in May 2021 is in full operation. The project covers 40 kilometers in the southern part. 10 kilometers will become two-way lines that will allow the canal to have 6 more ships at a time. Another 30 kilometers in the east side will be widened by 40 meters and deepened by about 70 feet to increase traffic by 28% and reduce the effects of weather conditions on shipping.
Construction in the last 7 years has so far shortened the crossing period for ships from 20 hours to 9 hours without congestion, and increased the average vessels crossing from about 35 or 40 in 2014 to 95 in late 2021, with more traffic expected once work is concluded in 2023. The upgrade has helped reduce the time of travel for shipping companies, making it faster and more cost-effective to transport through this passageway. The Suez Canal is a main source of hard currency for the North African country, so management is working hard on enhancing the maximum income from the water corridor.
There are incentives to attract more shipping companies. It includes discounted packages on passing ships based on vessels, weights and container numbers per shipping company. There are discounts for eco-friendly vessels. There are discounts on bunkering and logistical services to passing ships.
Furthermore, there's a positive outlook by experts for 2022. The recovery of international trade after the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines globally will lead to more demand on goods, an increase in international shipping, more traffic, and higher revenue for the Suez Canal. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now, but still to come on the show. China gets the green light to impose tariffs on $645 million worth of U.S. goods. And the U.S. Central Bank is expected to raise its key interest rate as early as March. Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. Now, earlier today, the World Trade Organization permitted China to impose tariffs on $645 million worth of goods from the United States. The long-running anti-dumping dispute with Washington stretches all the way back to 2012, when China decided to take the United States to the WTO. And that's after the United States imposed unfair countervailing duties on Chinese products such as solar panels, and that was between 2007 and 2011. Well, still on China-US ties, will we see a decoupling or recoupling of China-US economic ties? Well, CGTN spoke to Zhu Ning, professor of finance at the Shanghai Jiao Tong University, on these and, of course, some other aspects of bilateral ties between the two sides. Now, Zhu says decoupling is not possible in the financial sector, especially in a monetary policy. He also stressed on the importance of structural reforms. Take a listen.
I think decoupling is a notion which I think emerging market economists have been talking a lot over the past decade or so. But I think it will be quite difficult for China to decouple from the monetary cycle from the US. So I think that is an assumption, but that assumption has been proven wrong and wrong again over the past decade. So I'm not too sure that we will be able to distance China's monetary policy completely from that of the US. So in certain senses, I think the recent interest rate cut that we have witnessed in China might be actually a preparation for the potential interest rate hike as a result of the potential hike from the Federal Reserve. So in that regard, I think there are some discontinuity or a lack of synchronous coordination between China and the US, but I don't think those two countries are going into opposite directions in terms of monetary policy for the rest of 2022. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, regardless where the monetary policy is headed, I think structural change or structural reform is very essential to every country. I think different countries have their own structural challenges and have their own difficulties with economic, social, and political situations. That being said, I think each country would have to dive down and look closely at their respective challenges and really willing to take some of the short-term pain in order to achieve longer term goal of having a more sound structural change.
Well, let's shift focus to the U.S. now, where the central bank has signaled that it will probably start raising its main interest rate in March in order to win the economy of COVID-19 stimulus measures and, of course, try to cool inflation. Now, the easy money helped stimulate hiring and spending, but has also been blamed for triggering the highest price increase in decades. And as Owen Fairclough now reports, the question now is how fast those rates will rise to cool inflation.
The date investors have spent months waiting for.
The committee also agreed to continue reducing its net asset purchases on the schedule we announced in December, bringing them to an end in early March.
U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell signaling it's likely to start raising its benchmark rate from near zero 2 years after it was slashed to save the economy from COVID-19. And the decision to end this era of cheap money that stimulated borrowing, spending and hiring has been on the cards as conditions improved. But that low rate has also been blamed for fueling the highest inflation for 40 years and forced the Fed into hiking rates much faster than it intended.
High inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing and transportation.
But if Powell's decision answers some questions, it raises a fundamental one. Is the US ready to switch from low rates that have helped supercharge stock prices to higher rates that make borrowing more expensive?
You're not pouring gasoline on the fire, and you're raising interest rates into a market that hopefully will be strong enough to absorb it.
That will depend on how quickly the Fed tightens.
The question for investors and anyone engaged in any kind of financial planning is how many times that benchmark rate will be raised this year. The Fed thinks that unemployment is now low enough to handle that kind of tightening, and yet continues to describe the economic outlook as highly uncertain. And yet with inflation surging, there appears to be no alternative to raising rates. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Now, Brazil produces a significant amount of pine nuts, but right now just a small portion of them are exported. Well, our correspondent Paulo Cabral visited a production area where farmers and gatherers see great potential for selling their products abroad, especially in markets such as China.
The city of Cunha in the countryside of São Paulo state is one of the main pine nut production districts in Brazil. The nuts come from native trees found in the woods, the Araucaria pine, not from plantations, and in most cases they are gathered after they naturally fall from the trees by farmers like Darlênio Bruno.
This land and the Araucaria pines on them have been in Darlênio's family for 3 generations, and gathering the nuts has always been among their main activities and sources of income.
The pine nuts generate good revenue because there are no production costs. We don't need fertilizers or anything. We just have to gather and sell them. So trading in pine nuts is a good business.
Most of Cunha's pine nut production is sold locally, but producers are interested in trading with other countries, so they are joining forces through their association to begin exporting.
About 5 years ago, the associated producers shipped a few tons of pine nuts to China, but that was a one-time experience. They're working now on plans to export there again.
The goal of our association is to reactivate these contacts we had with China, so we can offer our pine nuts with an assurance of quality given by the association.
Part of the plan is to begin planting more Araucaria pines, specifically for nut production. There are specimens already being grown in a greenhouse in the region for a project supported by São Paulo State's Agriculture Secretary.
The trees we find now in the woods are quite old, so their production has been declining as the years pass. So the Agriculture Secretary has a program to encourage the planting of new trees to renew our production capacity.
Visitors to Cunha also have the opportunity to try nut-based recipes, like this fried pastry, a pastel, filled with locally grown shiitake mushrooms and pine nuts. Brazil's pine nuts are a traditional part of the local diet in parts of the country, and producers here say it's time to get more of them across borders, and indeed all the way to the other side of the globe. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Cunha, Brazil.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at commodity markets today. Oil prices extending gains to 7-year highs above $90 a barrel today. And that's as the Ukraine crisis outweighed clear signs that the U.S. Fed will tighten monetary policy. However, copper prices eased today after the U.S. Fed indicated it could tighten monetary policy quicker and faster than previously expected, and that boosted the dollar. Capping further losses were, of course, those low inventories of the metal in warehouses. Well, let's take a short break now, still to come. Nigeria exhibits what it calls the world's largest rice pyramids.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've been Tunis, Cairo, Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, Nigeria has unveiled a display of what it says are the largest rice pyramids in the world. The pyramids, made up of 1 million bags of rice, were constructed in the capital Abuja to mark the progress made in local production. But analysts say that Nigeria still needs to tackle the challenges of insecurity and inconsistent power supply for the country to reach its goal of achieving rice sufficiency. Here's CGTN's Tessem Akende reporting.
Augustine Enenche is preparing his farmland on the outskirts of Abuja ahead of a rice planting season. He is a beneficiary of an agricultural program by the government which granted him a loan to improve on his production for rice.
I was able to buy more fertilizers and seeds, which improved my rice production last year, and I hope to do more this new year.
In November 2015, the government launched the Anchor Borrowers program to boost agricultural production and reverse Nigeria's dependency on imported food. Beneficiaries include those cultivating cereals such as rice, maize, and wheat.
There are 13 rice pyramids here on the outskirts of Abuja produced by local farmers through the program. The country's central bank says the program has nearly doubled Nigeria's rice yield in 6 years.
The number of rice milling plants has grown from 60 to 50 since 2014.
It's a fact that Nigeria has improved its rice production over the past few years. It's a fact that the Anchor Boras program has contributed to what some people like to call the rice revolution.
A bag of rice is now sold at around $60 compared to about $17 in 2014. That's higher than the minimum wage in the country. Experts want the government to develop measures aimed at addressing challenges such as insecurity, which has led to the death of several farmers in the country. And other difficulties still remain.
And there's a lot of inefficiency in our system, whether it's ranging from power, ranging from the regulatory environment, where regulators adopt predatory tactics to extort money from businesses and others. So when you put all those things together in a basket, you have high cost of rice production. So we need to cycle our way back, and that's why I always talk about throwing money at problems don't solve any problem.
The government says it is committed to ending insecurity and other challenges affecting farmers. Economists say when that is done, farmers like Augustine Enenche will be able to cultivate more and also sell their products at lower prices. Kesum Akinde, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
And before we leave you today, a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand rising 0.6%, and that's ahead of a central bank meeting when investors expect a 25 basis points hike to 4% in the key interest rate. We saw the currency sliding nearly 1% against the dollar this morning, extending losses a day after the U.S. Fed provided the clearest indication that it is ready to hike interest rates. Meanwhile, Nigeria's Naira trading at around 416 against the dollar at the official investor and exporters window. It traded as high as 444 per dollar before settling lower during the day. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.